The cold has a voice. It whispers promises of sleep, of peace, of an end to suffering. It lies. Ethan Cole knew this truth better than most men. He had seen what the cold could do to flesh, to hope, to the will to survive. Tonight, as his truck carved through a North Carolina blizzard that swallowed the world in white fury, he would see it again. But this time, the cold would not win. This time, a warrior who had lost his way would find redemption in the storm, not through violence, but through the ancient, forgotten language of mercy. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the snow. Each pass cleared a crescent of visibility for half a second before the blizzard reclaimed the glass. Ethan Cole, a former Navy SEAL whose hands bore scars from a war that never truly ended, gripped the steering wheel with the same intensity he once held a rifle. The headlights of his F-250 barely penetrated 10 feet into the white chaos that had transformed Highway 221 into a ghost road. In the passenger seat, Rex shifted his weight. The German Shepherd's ears stood alert, swiveling independently like radar dishes. The dog had been Ethan's partner for 3 tours in Afghanistan, trained to detect explosives, to find enemies hidden in shadows, to protect his handler with loyalty that transcended instinct. Now, far from the dust and blood of Kandahar, Rex served a different purpose. He kept Ethan tethered to the present, a living reminder that some bonds survived even the wreckage of war. The truck's thermometer read -8 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind gusts approaching 60 miles per hour turned falling snow into horizontal bullets of ice. The National Weather Service had issued warnings for 3 days, urging residents to stay indoors, to avoid travel, to respect the power of Winter Storm Goliath. Most people listened. Ethan Cole was not most people. He had left his rented cabin in Boone 2 hours ago, driven by a restlessness that haunted him since his discharge 18 months prior. The therapist at the VA hospital called it PTSD. Ethan called it noise, a constant static that only quieted when he was moving, when survival required focus too absolute for ghosts to intrude. His destination was the old cabin his father had built 30 miles deeper into the Blue Ridge Mountains. Martin Cole had been a logger, a man whose hands knew the language of wood and stone, who believed civilization's greatest sin was forgetting self-reliance. He had constructed the cabin over 3 summers in the 1,980 seconds, a 2-room structure with a stone fireplace, hand-pump well, and walls thick enough to hold heat through the worst winters these mountains could conjure. Martin had died of a heart attack 7 years ago while Ethan was breaching compounds in Helmand Province. The funeral happened without him. The grief came later, in fragments, in moments between firefights when Ethan would remember his father's voice, teaching him to split wood, to read weather in bird behavior, to understand that strength without purpose was just violence waiting for direction. The cabin had sat empty since then. Ethan had never visited. The memories were too raw, the guilt too heavy. Going to the cabin meant confronting the truth that he had chosen war over family, and that choice had cost him the chance to say goodbye. Tonight, he was finally going home. Rex barked once sharp, urgent. The dog's body tensed, attention fixed on something ahead that Ethan couldn't see. Combat had taught Ethan to trust Rex absolutely. Ethan eased off the accelerator, letting momentum carry them forward at 15 miles per hour. Visibility had dropped to less than 5 feet. The road was invisible, buried under 2 feet of accumulation. Then the headlights found them. 2 shapes, dark against white, huddled together on the roadside. Not animals, not a fallen tree. Human forms, barely upright, clinging to each other with the desperation of people who knew they were dying. If you believe courage like this deserves recognition, show your support. Let this reach those who need to hear it. Ethan's training took over. His foot moved from accelerator to brake in a controlled motion. The truck slowed, anti-lock brakes pulsing, stopping 20 feet from the figures. He killed the engine, but left the headlights on. Rex was already moving toward the back seat, body language communicating readiness. Ethan grabbed the emergency bag from behind his seat: thermal blankets, first aid kit, chemical heat packs, energy bars, flashlight, satellite phone. He pulled on insulated gloves and opened the door. The cold hit like a physical assault. It wasn't just temperature, it was a malevolent presence seeking entry through every gap in his clothing. The wind screamed. Snow pelted his face hard enough to sting. He lowered his head and pushed forward, Rex at his side cutting a path through knee-deep snow. Each step was a battle against wind that sought to push him back, against cold that numbed his cheeks within seconds. As he got closer, details emerged. An elderly man and woman, both in their 70s, dressed for a casual day trip, not survival. The man wore a light jacket over a button-down shirt. The woman had on a wool coat adequate for autumn but useless against this storm. Neither wore gloves. Neither had proper boots. They clung to each other for basic mammalian need to share body heat, even as hypothermia stole that heat faster than their bodies could produce it. The man's face was pale, lips tinged blue, eyes glassy with early confusion. The woman was worse. Her eyes were closed, head resting against her husband's shoulder, breathing shallow. "Sir," Ethan's voice was firm, trained to cut through chaos. "I'm here to help. Can you hear me?" The man's eyes focused with agonizing slowness. When he spoke, his voice was a whisper torn by wind. "Please, my wife, Evelyn, she fell, can't get up." Ethan assessed with clinical efficiency. The woman Evelyn was in severe hypothermia, possibly stage 2. Her body had stopped shivering, meaning core temperature had dropped below 95 degrees. Without immediate intervention, she would lose consciousness within minutes. Death would follow shortly. Their car was nowhere visible. Finding it was impossible and irrelevant to survival. There was no time for explanation. Only action. "Get in the truck," Ethan commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who led soldiers through worse. "Right now. Move." The man tried to stand, but his legs buckled. Ethan caught him, one arm wrapping around his torso. Rex moved to the woman, positioning himself to provide support. Ethan half carried, half dragged the man toward the truck. Each step was negotiation with the storm, with physics of moving weight through deep snow against violent wind. His shoulders burned. His lungs ached from breathing air so cold it felt like swallowing glass. But he didn't stop. He got the passenger door open and lifted the man into the seat with more gentleness than urgency suggested. The man collapsed against the doorframe, body shaking with violent tremors as residual heat began painful rewarming. "Stay here," Ethan ordered. "Don't move. I'm getting your wife." He turned back into the storm. Rex had stayed with Evelyn, the dog's body pressed against hers, sharing heat like wolves had done since before humans invented fire. The woman's eyes remained closed, face a mask of pale stillness that terrified Ethan more than any enemy fire. He bent down, sliding one arm under her knees, the other behind her shoulders, lifting her in the fireman's carry every combat soldier knew by muscle memory. She weighed perhaps 110 pounds, light in his arms, fragile in a way that made him acutely aware of his strength and her mortality. The walk back was longer. The woman was dead weight. Wind had intensified, gusts now strong enough that Ethan had to brace himself to avoid being knocked sideways. Rex stayed close. Ethan reached the truck and positioned Evelyn in the back seat, laying her down as gently as combat-trained hands could manage. He grabbed thermal blankets from his bag and wrapped her in layers of silver insulation, then activated 2 chemical heat packs and placed them against her core chest and abdomen. Warming had to be gradual. Too fast could trigger afterdrop and cardiac arrest. Rex jumped into the back seat without command, curling his body around Evelyn's legs, adding his heat to the blankets. Ethan moved to the driver's seat, starting the engine and cranking the heat to maximum. The man was shaking uncontrollably now, teeth chattering so hard Ethan could hear them clicking. This was good. Shivering meant his body was still fighting. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, needing to keep the man engaged. Walter, the man managed through chattering teeth. "Walter Brennan, that's my wife, Evelyn." "I'm Ethan. You're going to be okay, Walter, both of you. But I need you to stay awake, stay talking. Can you do that?" Walter nodded, though his eyes kept drifting toward the back seat. Ethan pulled back onto the road, the truck's four-wheel drive engaged with mechanical certainty. They began moving at a crawl, 10 miles per hour, every sense focused on keeping them between the trees. If this stirs something in you, if protecting the innocent matters, share what true courage means to you in the comments. The cabin was 18 miles away. In normal conditions, 20 minutes. Tonight, it might as well have been 100 miles. But forward momentum was survival. "How did you end up out here?" Ethan asked. Walter's response came slowly, words slurred by cold. "We were driving back from our daughters in Asheville. Saw the weather coming, thought we could make it home to Blowing Rock before it hit. We're wrong. Classic mistake, underestimating mountain weather, trusting in luck instead of preparation. Car went off the road about mile back, maybe?" Evelyn hurt her ankle. Couldn't walk well. Tried to stay with the car, but so cold. Started walking, looking for help. Then Evelyn, she just couldn't go further. Sat down, and I couldn't leave her. 52 years married, couldn't leave her. A lifetime compressed into sentences broken by cold. Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror at Evelyn's still form. Rex's dark eyes watching her with almost human attentiveness. "You made the right call," Ethan said. The miles crawled past with agonizing slowness. The storm showed no signs of relenting. Twice Ethan had to stop when accumulation became so deep that forward progress was impossible, engaging four-wheel drive in low range and using momentum to power through drifts that came up to the headlights. Walter had stopped talking, head resting against the window, breathing shallow but steady. In the back, Evelyn remained unconscious, though Ethan hoped he could see more color in her face. The satellite phone chirped with a low battery warning. He had forgotten to charge it, one of many small failures that accumulated in a life marked by depression and isolation. But even if it worked, who would he call? Emergency services had stopped responding hours ago. Hospitals had issued statements telling people to shelter in place, that no ambulances were running. They were alone. Truly, completely alone in a way most people in modern America never experienced. No 911, no rescue coming. Just a man, a dog, and two strangers whose lives depended entirely on whether Ethan could remember everything his father taught him about survival. The turnoff to the cabin appeared like a ghost, materializing two stone pillars his father had built, now barely visible under snow. Ethan turned carefully, feeling the tires lose and regain traction before four-wheel drive caught and pulled them onto the narrow path. The road to the cabin was more suggestion than route, a quarter-mile of dirt track, winding through dense forest, rising in elevation. Tonight it was a tunnel through white chaos, trees pressing close, branches heavy with snow creating a claustrophobic canopy. Ethan drove by memory and instinct, steering around obstacles he couldn't see but knew were there. The truck climbed steadily, engine roaring, wheels churning through deepening snow. And then, through the snow, a shape, dark wood and stone, his father's cabin. Ethan felt something in his chest loosen as headlights illuminated the structure that represented safety, warmth, survival. The cabin looked exactly as he remembered. Simple rectangular building with steep pitched roof, log walls chinked with hand-mixed mortar, stone chimney rising like a promise of fire. He parked close to the front door, killed the engine, and turned to his passengers. "We're here," he said. "I'm going to get you inside. Get you warm. You're safe now." Rex stood in the back seat, tail wagging slightly, the first sign of relief the dog had shown. "Stay with us. What happens next will restore your faith in humanity." Ethan opened his door and stepped into the storm one more time. He moved to Walter's side first, gently shaking the old man's shoulder. "Walter, Need you to work with me. Need you to walk if you can." Walter's eyes opened, confusion evident. But somewhere beneath the cold and exhaustion, the will to survive still flickered. He nodded, reaching for Ethan's offered hand. Together they stumbled through snow to the cabin's front door. Ethan supported most of Walter's weight, his free hand reaching for the key he'd carried for 18 months without using. The lock was frozen, resisting his first attempt. He worked it back and forth until finally the mechanism yielded and the door swung inward. The interior was dark, cold, smelling of wood and dust and years of emptiness. But it was shelter. It was out of the wind. It was the first step back toward life. Ethan guided Walter to a chair, one of four surrounding a rough-hewn table his father had built. "Sit. Don't move. I'm getting your wife." He went back into the storm. Evelyn was still unconscious, Rex standing guard. Ethan lifted her again and carried her through snow that now reached his mid-thigh, each step requiring conscious effort and strength from muscle memory more than remaining energy. Inside, he laid Evelyn on the larger of two beds, a simple frame with thick mattress his father had insisted on buying new. The blankets were old but clean, stored in a cedar chest. Rex followed, immediately jumping onto the bed and resuming his position against Evelyn's legs. The dog's instincts were better than medical training. Core warming was critical, but peripheral warming mattered too. Ethan covered Evelyn with 3 thick quilts, then replaced the chemical heat packs with fresh ones. Her breathing was shallow but present. Her pulse was weak and slow but steady. She was alive. She was fighting. He turned his attention to the cabin. Survival depended on fire. His father's last gift revealed itself in preparation details. Firewood was stacked against the far wall, split and dried, ready to burn. Kindling filled a metal bucket beside the stone fireplace. Matches in a waterproof container sat on the mantel. Glass lanterns with full kerosene reservoirs waited to provide light. He built the fire the way his father taught him, crumpled newspaper at the base. Then kindling arranged in a teepee structure for airflow, larger splits positioned to catch once kindling established flames. He struck the match and held it to paper, watching flame bloom like hope made tangible. The kindling caught. Wood began to burn. Within minutes, flames crackled in the fireplace, and first waves of heat began radiating into the cold interior. Ethan moved through the space with methodical efficiency, lighting kerosene lanterns, checking the hand pump well in the small kitchen area to confirm it still worked. It did, though water that emerged was so cold it hurt his hands. He took inventory of supplies his father had left. Canned goods in the cupboard soup. Vegetables, beans. Rice and pasta in sealed containers, coffee and tea, a comprehensive first aid kit, blankets in the cedar chest, candles, battery-powered radio, everything someone might need if stranded. His father had called this place a traveler's rest, a sanctuary for those who lost their way. Martin Cole had been religious in the quiet, practical way of people who expressed faith through action rather than words. He believed serving others was the highest calling, that providing help to strangers was how humanity reflected the divine. The cabin was his church. Ethan had rejected that philosophy during his teenage years, finding it naive, impractical, weakness in a world that rewarded strength. War had reinforced that belief. In Kandahar, helping the wrong person could get you killed. Mercy was a luxury. Survival demanded hardness. But tonight, standing in the cabin his father built, watching 2 strangers slowly return to life through his actions, Ethan felt the first cracks forming in the armor around his heart. The fire was now roaring, the stone fireplace radiating heat that transformed the cabin from tomb to sanctuary. Ethan checked on Evelyn again. Her eyelids fluttered, the first voluntary movement he'd seen. Her breathing had deepened slightly. "Evelyn?" he spoke softly. "Evelyn, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened slowly, struggling to focus. Confusion crossed her face. "You're safe," Ethan said quickly, calm and authoritative. "You and Walter were caught in the storm. I found you on the road. Brought you to a cabin. You're hypothermic, but you're warming up. You're going to be okay." Her lips moved, forming soundless words. Ethan leaned closer. "Walter." The whisper was barely audible. "He's here. He's safe. Sitting right over there by the fire." Evelyn's eyes moved to find her husband. Walter had turned at the sound of his name, and when his eyes met Evelyn's, the expression on his face contained more emotion than Ethan had witnessed in years. Relief. Love. The primal gratitude of seeing someone you thought you'd lost return to life. "Evie." Walter tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. "Stay seated," Ethan commanded. "You're both still recovering. Moving too fast, risks after drop can crash your blood pressure. Just stay put. Talk from there." He moved away, giving them space, giving them privacy that even strangers deserved in profound vulnerability. Rex followed, his work done for the moment. Ethan stood by the window, looking out at the storm that still raged. The cabin was a small island of warmth and life in an ocean of white death. Beyond these walls, any living thing would die within hours. He had saved them. 2 lives that would have ended tonight if his restlessness hadn't driven him onto a road no sane person traveled, if Rex hadn't alerted him, if his father hadn't built this sanctuary decades ago in anticipation of a need he would never personally fulfill. The realization settled over Ethan like weight and relief simultaneously. For 18 months, he had moved through life like a ghost, convinced that everything good inside him had burned away in Afghanistan, that the only thing he was good for was violence and protection and grim calculus of survival. He had believed he was broken, that war had taken the man he'd been and left behind a damaged thing that needed to be fixed or managed or medicated into numbness. But tonight, he had been exactly who he needed to be. His training had saved lives instead of taking them. His strength had built shelter instead of breaking enemies. His father's legacy had merged with his own skills to create something that transcended both a moment of grace in a world that often felt devoid of it. If this moment moved you, if you felt its weight, share this story so others can witness what compassion truly looks like. Behind him, Walter and Evelyn were talking in soft voices, their words private, meant only for each other. The sound filled the cabin with something more warming than fire. The simple, profound music of 2 people who loved each other, confirming they were still alive, still together, still fighting. Ethan pulled his gaze from the storm and surveyed the cabin with new eyes. Dust covered most surfaces. Cobwebs occupied corners. The place needed work, needed care, needed someone to breathe life back into walls that had stood empty too long. On the mantel above the fireplace, a framed photograph showed his father standing in front of the completed cabin, pride evident in his weathered face. Next to it, a wooden box Ethan didn't remember seeing before. Curiosity pulled him closer. He lifted the box carefully, simple pine construction, hinged lid, no lock. Inside, he found letters. Dozens of them, some in envelopes, some loose, all handwritten in various styles. He pulled one out, unfolding yellowed paper. The date at top read the 15th of March 1994. "Dear Mr. Cole, my name is Sarah Jennings. I'm writing to thank you for saving my family during the ice storm 2 months ago. If your cabin hadn't been there, if you hadn't stocked it with everything we needed, my children and I would have died on that mountain. You asked for no payment, no recognition. You just wanted us to pass it forward someday. This letter is my promise that I will. Yours in gratitude, Sarah Jennings." Ethan read another. And another. The box contained letters spanning 20 years, from people whose names meant nothing to him, but whose stories all shared the same structure. They had been lost. The cabin had saved them. His father had asked nothing in return, except that they help someone else when the opportunity came. Some included photographs, families standing in front of the cabin, often in winter, always with expressions combining exhaustion and gratitude and relief. Some included small donations, $5, $10, whatever the writer could afford. His father hadn't cashed any. The checks were still in envelopes, decades old, effectively worthless now but preserved as tokens of goodwill. Your father was a good man. Ethan turned. Walter had managed to stand and make his way to the fireplace, moving slowly but under his own power, a sign that core temperature was rising toward normal. "You knew him?" Ethan asked. Walter shook his head. "No, but I know his work. This cabin, what it represents. There are stories about it, you know. Local legends. A place in the mountains where travelers can find shelter. Some think it's myth. Others know it's real but can't remember exactly where. The mystery is part of what makes it sacred." He gestured to the letters in Ethan's hands. "But I'm guessing it's more than myth to the people who wrote those." Ethan looked down at the box, at accumulated evidence of his father's life work. "I didn't know he kept these. I didn't know that he saved so many people." "He never talked about it?" "He tried, when I was younger. But Ethan's voice trailed off, words catching on shame and regret. "I thought it was just stories. Didn't realize they were true. Didn't care, honestly. I was too focused on getting out, on proving I was more than a logger's son from the mountains." Walter was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving from Ethan to the letters to the photograph. "The son often spends his life trying not to be the father," he finally said, "and then spends the rest of his life realizing he should have been." The words hit harder than any physical blow, because they were true. Ethan had spent his entire adult life running from his father's shadow, from the quiet, humble life of service Martin Cole represented. He had chosen the military to be something different, something he thought was more important. He had returned from war to discover that importance was measured in currency he didn't possess, that killing enemies and protecting assets did nothing to fill the void in his chest, that his father's simple acts of mercy had created more lasting good than all of Ethan's combat deployments combined. "He would have been proud of you," Walter continued. "Tonight, what you did for us, that was his legacy working through you." Ethan wanted to reject the statement, to argue that saving two people didn't balance scales against the men he'd killed, the families he'd destroyed in the name of national security and mission accomplishment. But the words wouldn't come. Because part of him, a part he'd kept locked away since Martin's death, desperately wanted the statement to be true. He carefully returned the letters to the box, closing the lid on decades of gratitude and grace. "You should sit back down. You're still recovering." Walter nodded, making his way back to the chair with Ethan's subtle support. Evelyn had drifted back to sleep, breathing now normal. Color improved. The crisis had passed. They would survive. The storm, however, continued to rage. Through the windows, the world remained white chaos. Darkness was falling rapidly. Early winter sunset accelerated by cloud cover so dense it turned afternoon into twilight. Ethan moved through the cabin, securing it against the long night ahead. He checked doors and windows, ensuring no gaps where wind could intrude. He added more wood to the fire, building flames higher, coaxing more heat from the stone fireplace his father had designed to maximize efficiency. He lit additional lanterns, pushing back darkness with warm, flickering light that turned the cabin into something that felt less like survival and more like home. In the kitchen area, he found canned soup chicken noodle, universal comfort food, and heated it in a pot over the fire. The smell filled the cabin, a domestic scent that felt surreal after hours fighting for survival against elemental forces. When hot, he poured it into mugs his father had made from carved wood, each one unique, each showing attention to detail that characterized Martin Cole's approach to everything. "You need to eat," Ethan said, handing a mug to Walter. "Your body burned massive energy fighting hypothermia. You need to replace it." Walter accepted the mug with hands that still trembled slightly, but held it without spilling. "Thank you for everything. I don't know how to express." "You don't need to," Ethan interrupted. "Just drink the soup, get warm, rest. That's thanks enough." He poured another mug and approached Evelyn. She stirred as he gently touched her shoulder, eyes opening with less confusion this time, more awareness. "Can you sit up?" Ethan asked. "You need to drink something. Get some calories into you." With his help, Evelyn managed to prop herself up against the headboard. She accepted the mug with shaking hands, but brought it to her lips and sipped carefully. The warmth brought tears to her eyes, not from pain, but from simple, overwhelming relief of being warm, being safe, being alive. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved our lives." Ethan didn't know how to respond. He had heard similar words before, from civilians rescued overseas, from fellow soldiers he'd pulled from burning vehicles. But those moments had been in the context of war, where heroism was expected, where saving lives was part of mission parameters. This was different. This was choosing to help strangers when no orders required it, when he could have driven past, when saving them served no tactical purpose. This was what his father had done for decades. This was mercy for its own sake. "Your husband said you have a daughter," Ethan said, shifting conversation to something less emotionally fraught. "In Asheville?" Evelyn nodded, managing a small smile. "Jenny? She's a teacher. Married with 2 kids, our grandchildren. We were visiting for Thanksgiving. The storm forecast said it wouldn't hit until tomorrow. We thought we had time." "Weather in these mountains changes fast," Ethan said. "Forecasts are often wrong." "Your father knew that," Walter interjected. "That's why he built this place, isn't it? Because he understood that people make mistakes, that the mountains are unforgiving, that sometimes folks need a second chance." Ethan looked at the older man, seeing intelligence and perception in eyes that had seemed glassy and confused just hours ago. "You seem to know a lot about my father's philosophy." Walter smiled. "I'm a retired pastor, spent 40 years preaching about grace and mercy and second chances. Your father's cabin is a better sermon than any I ever gave. It's faith, made tangible, the belief that we're meant to help each other, that compassion isn't weakness, that providing shelter to strangers is how we reflect the divine." The words resonated in ways Ethan wasn't ready to examine. He had given up on faith years ago, watching it dissolve in the face of war's brutality, of children killed by bombs that didn't discriminate, of prayers that went unanswered while good men died for reasons that became less clear with every passing year. But maybe faith wasn't about prayers answered or divine intervention. Maybe it was simpler. Maybe it was just the decision to help when you could, to build shelter for those who needed it, to pass forward the grace you'd been given in ways large and small. Maybe his father had understood that all along. Outside, a new sound joined the howl of wind, a deep, groaning crack, followed by a thunderous crash that shook the cabin. Ethan was at the window instantly, peering into darkness, trying to identify the source. A tree had come down, massive trunk and branches now visible as a dark shape against white snow fallen across what would have been the road. They were now completely cut off. Even when the storm passed, even if his truck could navigate the snow, they wouldn't be leaving until that tree was cleared. And Ethan's chainsaw was in his rented cabin in Boone, miles away. He turned back to his guests, who were watching him with expressions suggesting they understood the implications. "We're stuck," Ethan said, seeing no point in sugarcoating. "That was a big tree coming down, blocked the road. We're not going anywhere until the storm passes and I can cut through it. Could be a day, could be 3 days, depends on how long this blizzard lasts." He expected fear, maybe panic. Instead, Walter and Evelyn exchanged a glance that contained entire conversations, and then both nodded with a calmness that spoke to decades of facing challenges together. "We're alive," Walter said simply. "We're warm. We're not alone. Everything else we can deal with." The simple acceptance in those words carried more wisdom than Ethan had encountered in all his military briefings and tactical training. Survival wasn't just about having the right gear or the best plan. It was about maintaining perspective, about recognizing what truly mattered when everything else was stripped away. They spent the next hour in companionable quiet, broken only by occasional crackle of fire and Rex's soft snoring from his position on the bed next to Evelyn. Ethan found himself telling them about his time in the military, about Rex's training and their tours together, about the transition back to civilian life that had been harder than any combat deployment. In return, Walter and Evelyn shared their story 52 years of marriage that began when they were both 19, too young by conventional wisdom but certain in the way only the young can be. They talked about raising Jenny, about Walter's decades serving a small congregation in Blowing Rock, about Evelyn's career as a school librarian, about the quiet, ordinary life that from Ethan's perspective looked extraordinary in its stability and purpose. "Do you have family?" Evelyn asked at one point. "Someone waiting for you?" Ethan shook his head. "My father died 7 years ago. Mother passed when I was 12. No siblings. There was someone before my last deployment. But she couldn't handle what I'd become. Can't say I blame her." "You're young still," Walter said. "Time to build something new." "I'm 34 and feel 60. Not sure what I have to offer anyone." "You offered us life," Evelyn said quietly. "That's not nothing." Before Ethan could respond, a new sound cut through the storm, the distant rumble of an engine growing closer. Headlights appeared through the window, sweeping across snow, moving with slow determination of a vehicle designed for exactly these conditions. Rex was on his feet instantly, a low growl building in his chest. Ethan's body responded with muscle memory, hands instinctively moving to his hip where a sidearm used to rest. He forced himself to relax. They were in North Carolina, not Kandahar. The approaching vehicle was almost certainly help, not threat. The engine stopped. A door opened and closed. Heavy footsteps crunched through snow. A knock on the cabin door, firm but not aggressive. Ethan opened it to find a man in his 50s wearing the uniform of the county sheriff's department, covered in snow, exhaustion evident in every line of his weathered face. "Sheriff Maddox," the man introduced himself, his drawl pure Appalachian. "Got a report earlier today about 2 elderly folks missing on 221, car abandoned. Been checking every structure in a 30-mile radius. Figured this cabin was worth a look." "They're here," Ethan said, stepping aside. "Found them about 4 hours ago, brought them here. They were in severe hypothermia. They're stable now." Maddox's expression transformed from professional concern to genuine relief. He moved to where Walter and Evelyn sat, visually assessing their condition with practiced eyes of someone who'd seen plenty of winter casualties. "Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, your daughter's been out of her mind with worry. Called us this morning when you didn't show up, when your cell phones went straight to voicemail. We've had every available unit looking for you." He pulled out a satellite phone. "Let me call her. Let her know you're safe." While Maddox made the call, relaying good news to a daughter who by the sound of her voice through the speaker was crying with relief, Ethan stepped outside into the storm. The cold hit him again, but this time it felt different. Less hostile. More like the neutral force of nature. It actually was dangerous if unprepared or unlucky, survivable if you respected it and made the right choices. The sheriff's vehicle was a modified Jeep with lift kit, snow tires, and enough emergency equipment strapped to it to support a small expedition. Maddox had come prepared, had driven through the same conditions that would have killed most people, all to search for 2 strangers because someone's daughter was worried. It was the kind of thing Ethan's father would have done. When Maddox finished the call and joined Ethan outside, the sheriff offered his hand. "You did good work tonight. Most folks would have driven past, figured it wasn't their problem. You saved their lives." "I was in the right place," Ethan said, accepting the handshake. "Maybe. Or maybe you're the right kind of person." Maddox studied him for a moment. "You're Martin Cole's boy, aren't you?" "You look like him," got his eyes. "You knew my father?" "Everyone around here knew Martin, or knew of him. The cabin's famous in these parts, the place that's always there when you need it. Martin helped a lot of people over the years, more than most folks realize." "I'm learning that," Ethan admitted. Maddox nodded toward his Jeep. "I can take the Brennans with me, get them down the mountain to the hospital for a proper checkup. Road's still barely passable, but I know how to navigate it. In this storm, I've driven in worse, grew up in these mountains, know every back road and fire trail. Besides, the Brennans need more medical attention than what's available here. Mrs. Brennan, especially hypothermia, can have delayed complications. She should be monitored professionally. It made sense. But the thought of them leaving, of the cabin returning to its empty silence, created a hollowness in Ethan's chest that surprised him with its intensity. "Let me help you get them ready," Ethan said. Together, they went back inside. The Brennans received the news with mixed emotions: relief at the prospect of seeing their daughter, reluctance to leave the warmth and safety they'd found, and most of all, profound gratitude directed at Ethan that made him uncomfortable in its intensity. "I don't know how to thank you," Walter said as Ethan helped him into the heavy coat Maddox had brought. "You gave us our lives back, gave us more time with each other, with our daughter, with our grandchildren. That's a gift beyond measure." "Your father would be proud," Evelyn added, her hand gripping Ethan's with surprising strength. "This cabin, what it represents, you honored that legacy tonight. Promise me you'll keep honoring it." Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he spoke. The process of getting the Brennans into Maddox's Jeep was careful and slow, mindful of their still recovering bodies and the hostile environment beyond the cabin's warmth. Rex followed, the dog's protective instincts extending to these people he'd helped save, unwilling to let them leave without ensuring they were truly safe. When they were finally settled in the back seat, wrapped in emergency blankets, with the Jeep's heater running at full blast, Maddox turned to Ethan one more time. "Storm's supposed to break tomorrow afternoon. County will send crews to clear roads soon as it's safe. Probably be a couple days before this area is fully accessible again." He paused. "You okay up here alone until then?" "I've got supplies. Fire, water. I'll be fine." "I figured as much. You got that look the one soldiers have. Self-sufficient." Maddox extended his hand again. "You ever need anything, help with the cabin, information about your father's work, just someone to talk to you, call the sheriff's office. Ask for me specifically." "Thank you." Maddox climbed into the Jeep, and Ethan watched the taillights disappear into the white storm, carrying away the two people whose arrival had changed everything, who had given him a glimpse of who his father truly was, and who Ethan himself might still become. He stood in the snow for a long time, after the lights vanished, letting the cold wash over him, feeling it but not fearing it. Rex pressed against his leg, the dog's warmth a constant reminder that he wasn't alone, that connection existed even in isolation. Finally, he turned and walked back into the cabin. The fire had burned down to coals. He added fresh wood, watching flames spring back to life, transforming potential energy into heat and light and the promise of continuing warmth. What does courage mean to you? Share your thoughts. Your voice matters in this conversation. The box of letters still sat on the table. Ethan opened it again, pulling out letter after letter, reading stories of salvation and grace that his father had never mentioned, had never used to claim credit or seek recognition. Martin Cole had done this work in silence, believing that service was its own reward, that helping others needed no audience or applause. Ethan thought about his own time in the military. How many of his missions were classified, their details never to be shared, the lives saved or threats neutralized existing only in after-action reports few people would ever read. He had thought that silence diminished the value of his service, that heroism without recognition was somehow less meaningful. But his father had understood a deeper truth, that the most important work often happened in the dark, witnessed only by those directly affected, recorded nowhere except in the hearts of people who knew they'd been saved. In one letter, dated December 2001, a man named Thomas Michaels described being lost in a snowstorm, finding the cabin by pure chance, surviving because Martin had left it stocked and ready. The letter ended with a line that Ethan found himself reading over and over. "You built a lighthouse for travelers lost in the storm. You may never know how many lives that lighthouse has saved, but I promise you every person who finds it becomes a little more convinced that goodness exists in the world." A lighthouse in the storm, that's what his father had built. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because he believed the world needed places where strangers could find sanctuary, where the weary could rest, where the lost could be found. Ethan looked around the cabin with new understanding. The simple structure wasn't just logs and stone. It was a statement of faith, faith in humanity's better nature, faith that compassion mattered, faith that one person's decision to help could ripple outward in ways impossible to measure. He thought about his own future. He had been drifting since leaving the military, convinced he had no purpose in civilian life, that his skills were only valuable in combat zones where violence was currency and survival was victory. But tonight had revealed a different truth. His training, his ability to remain calm in crisis, to make life or death decisions without hesitation, to navigate hostile environments that would kill unprepared people, those skills had value beyond warfare. They could protect, they could rescue, they could serve. And this cabin, his father's legacy, needed someone to maintain it, someone to ensure it remained a sanctuary for travelers who lost their way, someone to carry forward the work Martin Cole had begun decades ago. Ethan stood, walking to the window, looking out at the storm that was finally beginning to show signs of weakening. The wind had dropped from a howl to a moan. The snow, while still falling, had lost some of its horizontal fury. Stars were beginning to appear in patches where clouds thinned tiny points of light breaking through darkness. Dawn would come, the storm would pass, roads would be cleared. Life would return to normal for most people, for Walter and Evelyn reunited with their daughter, for the sheriff's deputies who could finally rest after days of emergency response, for the thousands of residents who had sheltered in place and would emerge to dig out and rebuild. But for Ethan Cole, standing in his father's cabin with a dog at his side and a box of letters testifying to decades of quiet heroism, normal had shifted. The man who had driven into the storm lost and purposeless was not the man who would drive out of it. He knew what he needed to do. Over the next 2 days, as the storm gradually died and the world outside transformed from chaos to pristine, snow-covered silence, Ethan made plans. He would keep the cabin, not just as a property he owned but didn't visit, but as a living legacy. He would stock it, maintain it, ensure it remained ready for the next traveler who found themselves lost in the mountains. He would find a way to let people know it existed not through advertising or publicity, but through the same quiet network of local knowledge that had sustained it for decades. A word to Sheriff Maddox. A note to search and rescue teams. A mention to Forest Service rangers who patrolled these mountains. The people who needed to know would know. And when he wasn't here, he would train. He would become certified as a wilderness EMT, would upgrade his skills in cold weather survival, would learn everything he could about mountain rescue. He would transform himself from a warrior trained to take lives into a guardian trained to save them. It wouldn't erase the things he'd done in Afghanistan. It wouldn't bring back the people who'd died or undo the violence he'd participated in. But it would honor the best part of his father's legacy while giving purpose to the skills the military had burned into his muscle memory. On the morning of the third day, when county crews finally cut through the fallen tree and cleared the road enough for passage, Ethan packed up the cabin with methodical care. He restocked the firewood, refilled the kerosene lanterns, checked that food supplies were adequate and properly stored. Left a note on the table his father's practice he'd learned from the letters telling any future visitors to use what they needed and leave the place ready for whoever came next. Before he left, he stood in front of the photograph of his father on the mantel. Martin Cole looked back at him with an expression that Ethan had once interpreted as simple pride but now understood was something deeper. The satisfaction of a man who knew his life had meaning, who had built something that would outlast him, who had served a purpose larger than personal ambition. "I understand now," Ethan said quietly, speaking to a father who'd been dead for 7 years, but whose presence filled this space more completely than any living person. "I understand what you were trying to teach me. It took me too long, and I'm sorry for that. But I'm here now. I'll take care of this place. I'll take care of the people who need it. I promise." Rex barked once, a sound of affirmation, of readiness, of partnership in whatever came next. Ethan picked up the wooden box of letters, deciding to take it with him. Not to hide it, but to read every one, to learn the names and stories of the people his father had helped, to understand the full scope of Martin Cole's quiet ministry. These weren't just letters. They were a roadmap, a guide to how one person could make a difference through consistent, unglamorous acts of service that no one applauded but everyone who received them remembered. He locked the cabin door, testing it twice to ensure security, then climbed into his truck. The engine started on the first turn, reliable, even after days of bitter cold, a small miracle of engineering that felt significant in a week full of larger miracles. The drive down the mountain was treacherous but manageable. The county crews had cleared a single lane, pushing snow into massive walls on either side that turned the road into a tunnel through white. Ethan navigated carefully, his attention split between the road ahead and the rearview mirror where the cabin gradually disappeared behind trees and distance. He had come to the mountains to escape, to hide from the noise in his head and the purposelessness in his heart. To lose himself in isolation because connection felt impossible for someone who'd seen and done the things war demanded. Instead, he had found something he didn't know he was looking for, a way forward, a purpose that honored both his military training and his father's legacy. A chance to transform survival skills into salvation skills, to use his strength for protection instead of destruction, to become the kind of man who built lighthouses instead of merely surviving storms. In the weeks that followed, Ethan rebuilt his life with the same careful planning he'd used for military operations. He gave notice on the rented cabin and moved his belongings to a small apartment in Boone that could serve as a base camp. He enrolled in wilderness EMT training and cold weather survival courses. He reached out to local hiking clubs and search and rescue organizations, offering his skills and learning from people who had spent lifetimes in these mountains. The cabin became his project and his purpose. He reinforced the structure, updated the insulation, installed a backup heating system that didn't require electricity. He stocked it with medical supplies, emergency food, communication equipment. He created a simple website and left information at key trailheads and ranger stations, nothing commercial, just basic information. Sanctuary available. If you're lost, look for the stone pillars. The door is open. People came. Not many. The cabin's location was remote enough that only those truly in need would stumble across it. But they came. A family whose car broke down in February. A solo hiker who misjudged weather in March. A couple fleeing domestic violence in April, needing a place to hide and heal before they could face the world again. Ethan helped them all. Sometimes that meant just providing shelter and food and warmth. Sometimes it meant coordinating with law enforcement or social services or medical professionals. Always, it meant being present in the moment someone needed help, being the person who showed up when showing up made all the difference. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, but then with gathering momentum, the noise in his head began to quiet. The ghosts that had haunted him since Afghanistan didn't disappear. Trauma doesn't work that way. Healing isn't that simple. But they became less insistent, less overwhelming. The nightmares came less frequently. The anxiety attacks that used to paralyze him in crowded spaces gradually loosened their grip. Purpose, he discovered, was better than any medication the VA had prescribed. Service was more effective therapy than months of talking about his feelings. Building something positive didn't erase the negative, but it balanced the scales in a way that made both bearable. By the time summer arrived, Ethan had settled into a rhythm. He worked part-time for a local outdoor equipment store, sharing his expertise with hikers and campers preparing for mountain adventures. He volunteered with search and rescue, using Rex's training and his own skills to find lost hikers and injured climbers. And he maintained the cabin, checking on it weekly, restocking supplies, being ready for whenever someone needed the sanctuary his father had envisioned. On the anniversary of the storm that had changed everything, Ethan drove up to the cabin with a specific purpose. He carried with him a wooden plaque he'd commissioned from a local craftsman, words burned into oak in elegant script. He mounted it beside the front door where anyone arriving would see it immediately. Cole's Rest, a sanctuary for travelers. Built by Martin Cole, maintained in his memory. The door is open. Use what you need. Leave it ready for the next person. Pass forward the kindness you receive here. Below that, in smaller letters, a quote he'd found in one of his father's old journals, words that captured everything Martin Cole believed about service and humanity. We are all travelers in the storm. The only difference is that some of us have found shelter and now have the duty to be shelter for others. He stood back, looking at the plaque, at the cabin, at the mountains rising in every direction like ancient sentinels watching over the valley. Rex sat beside him, the dog's presence a constant reminder of partnership, of loyalty, of the bonds that connected one being to another. "We did it, Dad," Ethan said quietly, to the wind and the trees and the spirit of a man who was gone, but whose presence lingered in every log and stone of this place. "We're keeping it going. Your lighthouse is still burning." That evening, as sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and orange, Ethan sat on the cabin's porch with Rex beside him. His phone buzzed with a text from Walter Brennan. The old man checked in regularly now, had become something like family in the year since the storm. "Evelyn and I are thinking of you today. 1 year since you saved our lives. We'll never forget. You're doing your father proud, son." Ethan smiled, typing back, "Thank you. That means everything." Another message came through, this one from a number he didn't recognize. "Hi, this is Jenny Brennan. My parents gave me your number. I'm a teacher, and I'm doing a unit on everyday heroes with my students. Would you be willing to talk to them about your father's cabin and what it represents? I think they need to hear that compassion and service still matter in this world." Ethan stared at the message for a long moment. A year ago, he would have declined immediately, uncomfortable with attention, unwilling to talk about feelings or legacy or anything that required vulnerability. But he wasn't that man anymore. "I'd be honored," he typed back. "Let me know when." As darkness fell and stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Ethan remained on the porch, Rex's head resting on his lap. The night was quiet except for the soft sounds of the forest wind through trees, distant call of an owl, the gentle rustle of creatures going about their nocturnal lives. This was home now. Not just the cabin, but the mountains themselves, the work he was building, the person he was becoming. The warrior who had learned death in Afghanistan had learned life in these North Carolina mountains. He had discovered that the strongest battles weren't fought with weapons, but with choices, the choice to stop when others drove past, to help when indifference would be easier, to build instead of destroy, to become a lighthouse instead of merely surviving the storm. The cabin would stand through winter storms and summer heat, through decades and generations, a testament to one man's belief that compassion mattered, that helping strangers was humanity's highest calling, that building shelter for others was how you honored the gift of your own life. And Ethan Cole, former Navy SEAL haunted by ghosts of war, had found his mission, not in violence or vengeance, but in the quiet, steady work of maintaining a sanctuary for travelers who lost their way, in honoring his father's legacy while forging his own, in transforming pain into purpose, survival into service, isolation into connection. He had become the lighthouse keeper, and the light would never go out. Rex stirred, lifting his head to look at Ethan with eyes that held wisdom beyond human language. The dog understood, on some instinctual level, that they had found what they'd been searching for. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not an escape from the past, but a path toward a future worth living. Ethan scratched behind Rex's ears, grateful for the companion who had walked beside him through war and peace, through darkness and toward light. "We're home, boy," he said softly. "We're finally home." The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles, constant in their witness to the cycles of life and death, loss and redemption, darkness and dawn. The mountains stood silent and eternal, holding their secrets, sheltering their travelers, providing sanctuary to all who sought it with humble hearts. And in a cabin built by a logger who believed in grace, maintained by a soldier who learned about mercy, A light burned through the night, a beacon for the lost, a promise for the weary, a testament to the truth that one person's decision to help could change everything. The storm had passed, but the lighthouse remained. And that made all the difference.